Author event, Professor Melissa Klapper, Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, American Jewish Women's Activism, 1890 to 1940.
Hello, my name is Julie Gales, and I am the Madricha, or Philosophic and Ceremonial Leader of the Jewish Cultural Society, Ann Arbor Secular Humanistic Jewish Community. The Jewish Cultural Society, in partnership with the League of Women Voters for the Ann Arbor area, is very pleased to welcome you to Voices for the Vote, Stories and Lessons of Jewish Women's Activism in the Suffrage Movement, a conversation between two noted historians, Drs. Melissa Klapper and Deborah Dash Moore. This is the second collaboration between the Jewish Cultural Society and the League of Women Voters to promote citizen engagement through community service, activism, and voting. The League's year-long celebration of Votes for Women 100 gave us another opportunity to collaborate and mobilize people for upcoming elections. We were delighted when Melissa Klapper, author of an award-winning book about Jewish women's suffrage, agreed to come to Ann Arbor for our program. Plans for her talk were all in place. And then came the COVID-19 pandemic, and everything in our lives and related to this talk unwound. Yet, our desire to learn and to engage wasn't dampened by this new challenge. Dr. Klapper's flexibility in reimagining the program and bringing in Dr. Moore as a conversation partner re-energized us all. Jewish tradition teaches us that tikkun olam, or actions taken to repair the world, are fundamental to what it means to be Jewish. The concepts of working for social change, fighting for the disenfranchised, and speaking truth to power are some of the ideas of tikkun olam that are reflected in Dr. Klapper's book, Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, American Jewish Women's Activism, 1890 through 1940. Our live event at the Ann Arbor District Library has morphed into a virtual format. We greatly appreciate the work of the library's events team who are taping this conversation and will host it on aadl.tv. Chris Friark and Karen Jordan, the Jewish Cultural Society Social Action Committee co-chairs, have taken the lead in organizing this exciting event. Chris will be facilitating the later portion of our program. And now I'm delighted to introduce our participants. Dr. Deborah Dash Moore is the Frederick G. L. Hutewell Professor of History and Judaic Studies and the former director of the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She is the author of numerous books, including G.I. Jews, How World War II Changed a Generation, and is the co-editor of Jewish Women in America, a historical encyclopedia. Dr. Melissa R. Klapper is professor of history and director of women's and gender studies at Rowan University. She is the author of many books about American Jewish women's history, including the book you will hear about today. She also writes about history of American childhood, including, most recently, Ballet Class and American History. Deborah, I'll turn it over to you.
So thank you very much, Julie, for that lovely welcome. And it's a real pleasure to be here with the scholar, Melissa Klapper, who is so knowledgeable about the subject of Jewish involvement in women's suffrage. It's been a century, hasn't it, since the 19th Amendment passed, giving women the right to vote. And I thought we should begin with a general question, which is, why is this an important event to remember?
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks, Julie, and everybody who has been involved with this program at the Ann Arbor District Library, at the Jewish Cultural Society of Ann Arbor, and at the League of Women Voters. Thank you very much. And I also especially want to extend a thank you to Deborah, who has been a mentor of mine since I was in graduate school, many years ago. And I actually finished writing this book when I was a fellow at the University of Michigan. So I just want to extend my thanks to everybody, and particularly to Deborah. I think it is an extremely important event to be commemorating is maybe a better way to think about it, the centennial of suffrage in the United States. I often ask my students in women's history classes, why are they here? And a lot of them immediately have this very defensive reaction. Oh, well, I'm not a feminist, but I'm here, I'm learning something that I'm not here. And one of the things I always like to do is just to ask them, okay, there's no litmus test here. You don't have to be a feminist to be in this class. But just out of curiosity, how many of you think women should have the right to vote? And every single hand goes up, as I would say it should. Okay, without being too prescriptive, I also usually ask them if they think women should be able to drive and if married women should have credit cards in their own name. They say yes to all those questions, and I say, congratulations, you're a feminist. Those are all issues that women and men had to fight for. They were not given, they were not granted, they were not natural, okay? They were not things that were built into American society. They were things that they had to fight for. And therefore, okay, that is worth thinking about and worth remembering. And worth remembering and commemorating, not entirely in a heroic way that just assumes that everybody involved or that the movement from its inception was this pure thing that really wanted to only expand democracy. That was true on the larger, the very macro scale of things, but the suffrage movement had complications and personalities involved, and it wasn't so simple. And so I think what should be happening this year, and what the programs like this are doing, is really taking a closer look at that suffrage movement. I think why it's important is obvious in the sense that, half of the American public should have had the right to vote. But even that is a complicated statement, because women getting the right to vote did not enfranchise half the population because of other problems in American society. So for all these reasons, I think programs like this are really important in thinking about not just the victory, but also the struggle, the fact that there needed to be a struggle at all, and who was involved, and how we've told that story over time.
So you mentioned about how we've told the story, which I think is a really important point. And, it does make it into the general history books. There's a kind of standard narrative about how women won suffrage, as well as one that you alluded to that has sort of started to change. Could you elaborate a bit on what the standard narrative is and how historians have introduced, I think, important complications in the story, especially in regard to race and ethnicity?
Okay, well, there's a few things to say about this. One is that American history textbooks, until relatively recently, did a truly terrible job covering American women's and gender history. But they did, for at least about 100 years, they have included the suffrage movement in at least a basic way. The problem is that there's mention of the rightly famous first Women's Rights Convention in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. That should be in the history books. I'm not suggesting taking it out. But then the narrative kind of skips, it talks about that. It talks about some big names that we might know, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, maybe, or Susan B. Anthony, who was actually not at Seneca Falls, but did get involved with the movement very shortly thereafter. Maybe Sojourner Truth, which is something I'll come back to because there were African-American women and men there, and that matters too. And then it kind of skips over, we had this convention in 1848 and women demanded the right to vote, and then voila, in 1920, they got the right to vote. But there's a long time between 1848 and 1920. And actually, at that convention, including women's enfranchisement as a plank in the platform that came out of that was very controversial. Many of the members there, many of the people who went to that convention didn't think that the right to vote should even be on the list of demands they were coming out with. There were so many other problems facing women, so many legal and social and economic disabilities and disadvantages that a lot of the women there just didn't think that the vote was the thing. But it became the thing in the telling of women's history in a very simplistic way because it was a happy story, right? It had a happy ending. Women got the right to vote. women did in fact end up getting many of the other demands of that early convention. For instance, more educational opportunities, more professional opportunities, more legal rights, but all of those were things that had to be fought for. And so that period between 1848 and 1920 was one of unrelenting work on the part of generations, several generations of activists, male and female, white, African American, from many other immigrant and ethnic groups. And we do a disservice to the movement when we think about it only in that kind of fourth grade, let's put famous people on the posters on the wall kind of way. That's okay for fourth graders, but we're not fourth graders here. And I think that that is a problem with the narrative. There are two ways in which I think that has been expanded. One is more recognition of the fact that it took several generations in order, before women could get the right to vote, and looking more carefully at the different kinds of women's rights campaigns that were happening throughout those decades. Some were more immediately successful than others. You still could not say by a long shot that getting the right to vote in 1920 meant anything like full equality for women. But there had been advances. Certainly women's legal and economic and educational opportunities were certainly better in 1920 than 1848. It would be foolish to say otherwise, even though there were still problems. Women had way more opportunity by 1920 than they had earlier. However, those, as I said, were hard fought, and there was also a tremendous amount of variation in the United States. Your status as a woman depended very strongly on where you lived, north or south, east or west, states that were already part of the United States, states that were coming into the United States that were initially territories and only being granted statehood as things went along, and also a larger discussion through a real transformation in the way that people thought about gender and women more generally during that period. So I do think that the narrative of suffrage has expanded pretty successfully in that way, and the standard American textbook is more attentive to some of those issues now. What is an even more recent development, but a really critical one, is looking at the suffrage movement and noticing that it was not just white, middle-class, Protestant, Northeastern women who were involved in the movement. There's no question that some of those women were extremely important, right? And no one's trying to take that away from them. Susan B. Anthony was an important women's rights activist. She should be remembered. But when you're talking about commemorating and remembering an entire movement, it's important to think about the expansiveness of that movement. Who was included, who was excluded, who wanted to be included, and who had no interest in the suffrage movement. There were also activists who thought the suffrage movement was very wrong-headed, not so much because they opposed women getting the right to vote, but because they just didn't think that was a priority or the most important thing, or the thing that would help women the most. So to take an example from the late 19th, early 20th century, socialist women were kind of about the right to vote. They thought it was not a bad idea, but for them, class struggle was much more important than a rights movement based on gender. And so that's one kind of complication. And another has to do with race. African American women were involved in the suffrage movement from the beginning, and they helped shape it. And they also were involved in some of the complications of that suffrage movement. As one example, shortly after the Civil War, when the Reconstruction Amendments were being voted on, the 15th Amendment in particular did the extremely important work of enfranchising former slaves. But it was also the case that for the first time, the 15th Amendment, which outlawed discrimination or disenfranchisement based on former condition of servitude aimed at former slaves, but that 15th Amendment included the word male for the first time. And there was a huge split in the suffrage movement. Some people, including women who had been extremely committed abolitionists there, for decades at that point, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony said, we cannot support anything that is going to introduce the word male into a discussion of voting rights. And they went off and founded their own organization. Other women and men who supported suffrage, and all of these people had been comrades in arms in the abolitionist movement, people like Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass said, we're sympathetic to this, but now is what Douglass called, quote, the Negro's hour. We have to prioritize the needs of former slaves. And so the suffrage movement suffered this huge divide that split the movement from 1869 all the way through 1890, an entire generation of people who supported suffrage did so in different ways and with different priorities. And unfortunately, something else that happened during that time was that those who had not supported the 15th Amendment because it excluded women sometimes then began to kind of fall into the perilous path of saying racist things, right, and started blaming African Americans for the fact that women didn't have the right to vote. And that kind of latent or new racism to some of these people really is a stain on the suffrage movement. And it had the effect not of keeping African American women out altogether, but of making those women think about where their own priorities lay. Where did their problems come from? Was it primarily because of their race or their gender? Now, of course, those two things cannot and should not be completely pulled apart. Academics use the term intersectionality to talk about how it is impossible to say that your condition in life is just because of one thing: your religion, your race, your class, your gender, whatever it is, your sexuality. But for a lot of Black women, they're as a practical thing to decide where they wanted to put their energies, this was an issue. And for ethnic groups as well, and here's where Jewish women come in, this could cause problems sometimes, because there were multiple state campaigns to get suffrage amendments passed, at least within a state, if not on the federal level. And in some of those states, campaigns failed repeatedly. And some of those states had large immigrant and large Jewish populations, and Jewish women and men were sometimes blamed. And there was anti-Semitism from the very earliest period of the suffrage movement. There was a strain of anti-Semitism that never totally went away and confronted Jewish women with a problem. How do they work for a cause they believe in a movement that doesn't want them? And so thinking about African-American women, Jewish women, Italian anarchist women, lots of different groups that didn't fit that profile has become a really important part of the suffrage narrative and something that needs to be remembered when thinking about how to commemorate that movement.
So I'd love you to say a little more about the roles that American Jewish women played in the suffrage movement. I realize that it's a wide group of women that includes recent immigrants. It includes people who were born in the United States. It's really pretty diverse, and it would be great to learn a little more about just the roles that American Jewish women did play in suffrage.
Okay, so American Jewish women were involved in the suffrage movement from its earliest years. In the antebellum period, there was a suffragist named Ernestine Rose, who actually, except when she was defending Jews from anti-Semitism, did not particularly identify as Jewish, but she was identified as Jewish, which was another issue for Jewish women activists. They did not always have control over how they were perceived in the press or by their fellow, or their sister, I should say, activists. So there were a few, Jewish women here or there. It's not really until later in the 19th century that Jewish women got involved in the suffrage movement in large number. There were always a few. One thing that is true throughout the entire period of suffrage activism is that the Jewish women who got involved typically did so as individuals, and only rarely through the Jewish women's groups that were starting to spring up during the late 19th and early 20th century. So a major reason for that is, as I've already alluded to, anti-Semitism. It was very difficult for a Jewish group like the National Council of Jewish Women, which in every conceivable way fit the profile of a group that supported suffrage. And in fact, the vast majority of the individual members of the National Council of Jewish Women supported suffrage. Famous suffrage leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the head of the major suffrage organization in the US, came to speak to the National Council of Jewish Women at its conventions. And yet the National Council of Jewish Women never formally endorsed suffrage. And that, I argue in the book and elsewhere, is because of anti-Semitism in the movement. In 1895, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who by then was, very advanced in years, but a very sharp and radical thinker, presided over the publication of something called the Woman's Bible. Now, if we were to read the Woman's Bible today, it would still be radical and shocking. Okay, I will say this for myself, it's one of the most radical religious texts I've ever read. It is a huge, extremely sharp critique of organized religion for, blaming organized religion, but particularly the Judeo-Christian heritage, let's call it, for misogyny and patriarchy and all that's wrong with the world. And there were elements of the Women's Bible that were really explicitly anti-Semitic in the worst possible kind of way. And that turned off a lot of Jewish women. They could not imagine, as groups in particular, getting involved with anything with a movement that had this in its DNA. Now, I should say that the mainstream suffrage movement, which had a lot of Christian religious women in it, immediately said, "Oh no, this is not us. We are renouncing, we are denouncing and renouncing. We don't want to have anything to do with this." And as a side note, one of the reasons why there's a coin with Susan B. Anthony's face on it, but not her partner, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, is because Stanton was by the end of her life, was so ostracized by the suffrage movement, they almost tried to write her out of the story because she was just too radical for them. But still, for Jewish women, the fact that this famous suffragist could do something like that was a real problem. And that, I think, explains why Jewish women's groups were slow, reluctant, or sometimes refused to actually formally endorse the movement. However, that did not stop many, 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 and several generations of individual Jewish women from getting involved. And especially starting in the mid to late 19th century, American-born Jewish women in particular, who were educated in the United States and who felt a certain comfort level, especially a cohort that was kind of middle class and had some financial security, really got very heavily involved in the suffrage movement. I'll talk a little bit more about one of those people in a minute, a woman named Maud Nathan that I definitely want to say something about. But there was a whole cohort of Jewish women who were involved in both Jewish women's organizations, like the National Council of Jewish Women, and in secular, non-sectarian, non-denominational women's movements and women's activism on a number of fronts, including suffrage. And they stumped for suffrage, they marched, they picketed, they signed petitions, they were involved with bringing suffrage resolutions before Congress every year during the late 19th century. They ran suffrage campaigns all over the United States, particularly in the West, but elsewhere also, so that individual Jewish women's names pop up everywhere once you start to look for them. And what I was interested in the book is, well, did that make any difference to the suffrage movement overall? And my answer to that is yes. Okay, I do think so. You can't claim that the suffrage movement would never have happened without American Jewish women, which is a claim I do make for other forms of women's movements in the early 20th century. But it is also the case that the presence of Jewish women in suffrage movements on the local and the state level in particular had an impact. And even though the movement may not have been that inclusive, the presence of proudly Jewish women who talked about their Jewish heritage as a reason for their involvement really expanded the movement. And of course, I would argue should expand the history of it as well. It is also the case that the American Jewish community, if not Jewish women's groups, had a very lively debate on the subject of suffrage. One American Jewish newspaper called the American Hebrew, which was an English language newspaper aimed at pretty acculturated American Jews, many involved with the Reform movement of Judaism, the more liberal end of religious practice, said in 1912, suffrage is in the air, right? Everyone's talking about it, whether you're an anti or not, or you're supportive, everybody's talking about suffrage. And the American Jewish periodicals, I did a tremendous amount of research into these periodicals, and they all wrote and covered suffrage all the time. It was a very important topic within the American Jewish community, and there was widespread support. That was true among the American-born activists and the American-born Jewish community, but it was also very true in the immigrant Jewish community. Many Eastern European Jews who were pouring into the United States during the late 1800s and early 1900s came pre-radicalized. Many of them were involved with political movements, and in the case of women, with public activity already in Europe. And so when they came to the United States, they continued that activism. And to them, it was just almost this reflexive thing. Of course, women should have the right to vote. Right? It was just an obvious thing. It might not have been their main goal, but it was important to them. So that Yiddish newspapers also covered suffrage in a very significant way, and again, almost always in support of it. There were some Jewish anti-suffragists, I'll come back to this in a minute, and there was sometimes resistance, but even within the most kind of right-wing political Jewish segments of the American Jewish community, or even within the most kind of Orthodox or religiously traditional elements, there was a lot of support for suffrage, and they looked to biblical precedents. You see speeches from rabbis across the denominations that point to biblical figures like Deborah or Esther or Miriam and say, well, you know, our modern Jewish women today should be like the Jewish women of old. They can hold leadership positions. This is not a threat to us. And so American Jewish women as individuals on every level worked for the suffrage movement, supported it, and I should point out, turned out when they could to vote for it. Because of course the problem with women getting the right to vote was that they couldn't vote to give women the right to vote. They didn't have the currency they needed to get what they wanted. And so Jewish men had to vote. And any place where statistics were kept and where they could look at this kind of thing, it was just the case everywhere in New York City, but in other places as well, that any place that had a large Jewish population generally voted overwhelmingly in favor of suffrage when they had the opportunity to do so. And so that is just further evidence. You know, if that many Jewish men were supporting women's right to vote, you can imagine how many more Jewish women were supporting women's right to vote.
So thank you. That's really fantastic. I heard that you mentioned Maud Nathan, and she had a sister, Annie Nathan Myers, right? And they did not agree on the issue of suffrage. So could you speak a little bit about this conflict of two sisters of very similar upbringing, the whole bit, and yet took different stands on the issue?
These are two of my favorite people to talk about. I've been doing research on both of them as girls and as women, you know, for a long time, and they are very interesting figures. So Maud Nathan and her sister Annie Nathan Meyer, were actually from old Sephardic families. Their families had kind of Spanish Portuguese roots. They were both members of the Daughters of the American Revolution. They had family that was, you know, in the colonial United States. They grew up in both New York and in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Long story, but then they ended up back in New York. Maud Nathan married her cousin Frederick Nathan, so she never changed her name. Her sister Annie married Alfred Meyer, so Annie Nathan Meyer. And these were two very prominent women. They were very financially comfortable, both of them. They grew up in, you know, financially comfortable circumstances and then married pretty wealthy men. That is important because it meant that they had certainly more time than a lot of middle class and certainly more than immigrant working class women would have had to be devoted to a cause. Both of them were extremely involved with women's other corners of the women's movement. This is what I mean by saying that the suffrage movement is not the only thing, getting the right to vote is not the only thing women were working on. Maud Nathan was extremely involved for decades before and after her involvement in the suffrage movement with something called the Consumers League, which looked out for the interests of working class women and had what were called white label campaigns that people would only buy goods from workplaces where women were treated well and up to a certain standard. It could even be a simple thing like shop girls being allowed to sit down for a certain percentage of the day, but she was interested in the labor conditions of people who were not like her. Annie Nathan Meyer was extremely interested in women's education. Because her family had moved around a little bit, she felt deprived of the opportunity to have more education, and she got involved with educating herself, and she initially was part of a group that convinced Columbia to offer some kind of extension classes to women, and then she was one of the founders of Barnard College. Okay, so these two women both had public profiles in women's rights movements, even before and during the period that we're talking about now. Maud Nathan became the most prominent American Jewish women suffragist. Okay, she was she spoke all over the country. She was often the first woman to ever speak from the pulpit of various synagogues, again, all over the United States. She spoke to immigrant Jewish audiences. She had a Yiddish translator, and then she eventually learned some Yiddish herself, so she wouldn't need the translator. She had connections with the labor movement because of her work in the Consumers League, so she was friends with prominent American Jewish women who were immigrants and working as labor activists. She very often called on Jewish themes when talking about why women should have the right to vote and why the Jewish community in particular should support it. She was a very dignified woman, very tall, very stately, to use the terms of the time. It was important to her to always dress beautifully so that she could show in her own person that suffragists were not masculine, were not, to use the term at the time, mannish. They, could be just as elegant and just as womanly as anyone else, but also politically enfranchised. She was a very savvy person, and because she was fluent in French and German, she was also involved in the International Women's Suffrage Alliance as a parliamentarian and as a translator. So she often went abroad and represented not Jewish women, but American suffragists in herself. In the summer of 1913, for instance, she went to 5 different international women's activist conferences in Europe in just one summer, including the International Women's Suffrage Alliance conference, which was held in Budapest that year. So she was a very well-known suffragist. Now, her sister, Annie Nathan Meyer, had the profile of somebody who would also have been a suffragist. Here's a founder of Barnard. She was a playwright. She was a poet. She was often frustrated that she didn't get produced or published as often as she would like, but she was a writer. She was involved with other communal organizations, and Annie Nathan Meyer was the most prominent Jewish anti-suffragist. These two sisters were on opposite sides of this issue, despite the fact that Annie Nathan Meyer had exactly the profile you would expect for someone who supported suffrage. Why is that? So the most basic answer to that is honestly that they just did not like each other. And Maud said, I believe in this. And Annie said, not me, I'm going to go that way. So there was a considerable amount of personal animosity there. And I also think that at a certain point, they began to almost enjoy taking this animosity public. One would write a letter to the editor, the other one would write a letter to the editor in the next issue. One would get up on a stage and say something, the next one would get up on the stage and say something else. They sometimes debated each other. It was a public spectacle. In New York suffrage circles, everyone knew about these two sisters and their odd differences. But to give Annie Nathan Meyer a little intellectual credit, which we should, it wasn't just a personal reflex. She disagreed with the suffrage movement in the sense that a lot of activists, including Maud, although she wasn't the kind of biggest exponent of this, a lot of suffragists claimed that once women had the right to vote, they would basically purify politics. That politics would no longer be any kind of dirty or corrupt business, that everything in the world would function better, that basically women getting the right to vote would solve all the evils of the world. And Annie Nathan Meyer thought that was the dumbest thing she had ever heard. She called it, this is a very late 19th century term, but she called it spread henism, the idea that a hen would come and spread her wings and fix everything. And she thought that was ridiculous. And she was concerned that suffrage was too closely linked to feminism, a term that was in use in the early 20th century, and she didn't buy all of the way she defined feminism. She thought they should be on separate tracks. And so for her, suffrage was claiming too much. It was claiming to do too much, and it was actually a threat to the value of women's traditional domestic roles. And she had this intellectual argument, which I do think we have to give some credence to. I will say that her own personal credibility, she's not the only one who felt this way, is a little diminished, because as soon as women got the right to vote, the first thing that Annie Nathan Meyer did was to join the League of Women Voters. So it's not that she didn't use the vote once she got it, but that you did have these two sisters who made a public spectacle of themselves. It was covered in the press. And for the American Jewish community's perspective, it was great PR. It was a wonderful way to get the Jewish community to think about it, because whether they were pro, which most of them were, or con, which some Jewish people were in the United States, they had a Nathan sister to represent them, and to represent them beautifully and get taken very seriously in the wider world of women's activism. And so these two sisters were, they're a fun story to tell, but they do also represent different ideas about suffrage. These weren't just knee-jerk reactions people had to women getting the right to vote. They really thought about it. Maud Nathan thought that it was only right and just for women to have the right to vote, but she also thought it was, to use a term that the historians have used, expedient. That in the sense that if women had the right to vote, they could improve working conditions for working women, for instance, something she had been concerned about for a really long time. That women might not purify the world. Maud Nathan didn't really think that, but they could improve things dramatically. She had a long laundry list in her speeches of things that were better in states that had already given women the right to vote. working conditions for women, increasing the age of consent for marriage, so that to protect younger girls. There's a whole long list of things that when women got the right to vote, things did change. And so that was where Maud Nathan was coming from. Let's make the world better. Maybe not cure everything, but we can improve the world by women getting the right to vote. And Annie Nathan-Meyer just did not agree with that approach.
Great story. Yeah, so thank you. You indicated before that in some states like New York, Jewish men had the chance to vote on the issue, and that they were in favor of suffrage. Why did they choose to support suffrage? What was their thinking? Did they sort of agree with a Maud Nathan, or did they have other reasons that drew them to support women having the right to vote?
Okay, well, just to back up 1 minute, let me just say that the suffrage movement had a kind of reunification in 1890 when the National Association of Women, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was founded. It brought back together the two groups that had split after the Civil War. And at that point, the suffrage movement was re-energized. And there was a debate, should we keep on going for a federal amendment, okay, or, which is what one of the suffrage groups had been doing, or should we try to go state by state? The federal amendment doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Maybe there are states that we can actually convince to support suffrage, and there was precedent for that. For instance, Wyoming, upon becoming a state in 1869, had already enfranchised its women. And so from then on, the suffrage movement proceeded along both tracks. And that meant that certain states had the option and the possibility of running their own campaigns and having referenda in those states to see, what the population itself wanted. So in a state like Utah, for instance, which did not have a big Jewish population, but in Utah, part of the deal for, Utah wanted women to have the right to vote as it was trying to become a state in the United States in 1896. There's a whole long backstory to that, which has to do with the Mormons and the Church of Latter-day Saints, and the large Mormon population in Utah wanted women to have the right to vote so that they could protect things that were important to the church. Initially, plural marriage was one of those things, but then the United States basically said, no, you can't become a state as long as plural marriage is part of your religion. You got to get rid of it. They did. So actually, plural marriage has not been part of the official Latter-day Saint platform since 1896, which is important because in popular culture, everyone thinks that Mormons are all engaged in plural marriage, which is just not the case. So their different states had different kinds of trajectories. And so a lot of the Western states, actually, as they moved from territory to state status, enfranchised women as they came in. Colorado was another example. In 1893, Colorado was a big victory. This was shortly after the reunification. Colorado enfranchised women in 1893. There were also places where they weren't necessarily talking about presidential elections, maybe state level or local level, like school boards. It was very easy for women to make the argument, well, we're the teachers, we're the mothers, we should have some say in the schools. So women throughout this period were taking their traditional domestic responsibilities, keeping homes clean, taking care of children, running households, and saying, if we do that at home, and we know what to do, and we're expert, and you all agree that this is our job, we should take this job out into the wider world. And women use that in order to get more political power on every conceivable level. And that worked in many kinds of states. Another big state that had a victory on the earlier side of this was California. California had an unsuccessful referendum first in 1910 and then successfully enfranchised women in 1911. And a Jewish woman named Selena Solomons, and actually her mother also, a woman named Hannah Mark Solomons, were very important in that drive, particularly in the San Francisco area, where they got working class women and middle class women to work together on a suffrage campaign. Now, in states like New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, there was a referendum in 1915, and in every single one of those states, it failed. It did not pass on the first round, and the Jewish community was blamed for that in many cases. This is another example of anti-Semitism rearing its head, even though it did not match the reality of the voting record. And that's when I think for the first time American Jewish men were asked to not just to have an opinion, but to talk about it more. Now remember, the American Jewish press had been covering suffrage for a long time. And Jewish men supported suffrage for all the same reasons that women did. Some of them believed it was just the right thing to do. Okay? Some of them believed that there was no reason to keep women disenfranchised. Some of them saw their support for suffrage in a Jewish context, the same way that Jewish women did, looking for biblical precedents of leadership, or at least not seeing anything that would stop, within Judaism, that would stop women from having the right to vote. Some men really believed in the idea that women would purify politics. That was not a belief that was only held by women. There were also men who felt that way. There were men who just felt like, well, I have a mother and I have daughters. You hear this kind of rhetoric sometimes. It kind of makes me cringe in some contexts, but the idea that, I want my daughters to be full, citizens, particularly for immigrant working class Jews in America who wanted as much regularization of their status as possible, as soon as possible. There were large immigrant populations committed to various political ideologies, socialism, sometimes communism, anarchism, who really thought, well, if the women who share my beliefs have the right to vote, we might have more of a shot of actually getting some of our program put through. So there's this variety of reasons why Jewish men would have supported it, and I think for some of them it was just the right thing to do. There could have been a Jewish justification, but there didn't have to be. Frederick Nathan, Maud Nathan's husband, was a founder of the Men's Equal Suffrage League in New York, and even though he was quite sick and ailing, he went in a wheelchair, first in 1915 and then in 1917, to vote in favor of suffrage. And a very important Jewish male figure who supported suffrage publicly was Louis Brandeis. He was, on his way to becoming he wasn't yet, but on his way to becoming the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, and he had a lot of influence. And the fact that he publicly came out, so to speak, as a suffragist had an enormous impact on the American Jewish community. So men supported the cause for a number of reasons, just as women did, including some Jewish justification.
So once the vote happens, not just in the States, but we get the 19th Amendment and everything. How did the American Jewish community respond to the fact that now, okay, women have the right to vote, and what sort of flowed from that in terms of Jewish communal politics and thinking within the Jewish community about the right to vote?
Okay. There's a few answers to that. One is that the Jewish women's organizations, groups like the National Council of Jewish Women, and by then Hadassah had started in 1912 and had already gained a lot of members in less than 10 years. Groups like the Ladies Auxiliary of the Workmen's Circle, which was a socialist group of immigrant, a Yiddishist socialist group, and a variety of other women's groups. Now they actually say, you can read their newsletters and their publications from right after women get the right to vote, and they say, okay, now we don't only have 3,000 members, we have 3,000 voters, right? People are going to have to listen to us and pay attention to us. We now have more political power. It's not like they hadn't lobbied and tried to have a political voice before, but now the fact that they could vote meant that they had more of a voice and more political power. The National Council of Jewish Women almost immediately joined something called the Women's Joint Congressional Committee, a group of women's groups that lobbied as a unified force in DC for all kinds of things to improve the situation of women and children around the United States. And these groups had an impact. In the years immediately after women got the right to vote, Congress, for instance, passed legislation to help with maternal and child health, and a variety of other things that women's groups had been agitating for a long time. There was concern among the politicians, among the mostly male politicians, that women would vote as a bloc, that women would say, okay, we're not going to support you unless you do X, Y, and Z. That turned out not to be true, which from our perspective is not so surprising, since we can see that women were divided. Right? They were divided by all kinds of things. They were divided by racism, among other things. They were divided by anti-Semitism. They were divided along many lines. The idea that all women would vote the same way was just as silly as thinking that women could purify everything just by getting the right to vote. But in the immediate years after suffrage happened, there was a concern among politicians that women would, in fact, vote them in or out based on their attitudes towards issues of concern to women. So Jewish women were involved with that, and in a way, the National Council of Jewish Women started a lobbying arm, and from then on had a representative in Washington, D.C. And they took this kind of thing very seriously. In other ways, the Jewish community was affected. Many Jewish women in congregations across the United States said to their synagogue boards, "Look, we now have the right to vote in national elections. You got to let us on the board. We want to be officers. We want a say in how our congregations are run." And many congregations just immediately said, "You're right." Not all of them did, but there actually wasn't that much resistance. But if you look at the lists of the people who are board members or the resolutions that were passed in all kinds of synagogues, from the most liberal to the most traditional, you see that women had more of a voice in them shortly after the 19th Amendment was passed. So that was a big impact on the American Jewish community. So that Jewish women were getting a political voice, so to speak, not only in kind of American politics, but also in the Jewish communal world, which was extremely important. So that's another way in which it mattered that these women got the right to vote. And I also think that as more countries enfranchised women, and there were a number of countries in the aftermath of World War I, including, of course, the United States, where that happened, there was a kind of interest in the international Jewish community about women's political voice and women's political action. And you start to see both international Jewish women's organizing. For instance, there was a World Council or Congress of Jewish Women that met for the first time in 1923, so very shortly after a lot of countries got the right to vote. But also in thinking actually in a kind of interesting way, just as mass immigration was almost coming to an end in a lot of countries, you have Jewish women in a variety of countries thinking about themselves as members of a diaspora in a way that maybe not all of them had before, and in a politicized way. What can we do with other Jewish women around the world to improve the situation of Jewish people around the world? And there's a number of ways in which you see that. The National Council of Jewish Women, the Workmen's Circle, Ladies Auxiliary, and Hadassah were all involved in international reconstruction efforts after World War I, as just one example. And when men wouldn't let them go, they just went by themselves. They got together their own delegations, and if you're not going to let us in, we're going to go anyway. And I think that Jewish women were really emboldened by getting the right to vote to demand more participation and activism and activity on an international as well as a national and a local scale.
So that's really interesting. Could you, I'm thinking, for example, of the impact of the creation of bat mitzvah, which I think surely was one of the things that emerges out of women getting the right to vote. With Mordechai Kaplan's oldest daughter, he only had daughters, and 1920, and so it's 1922 when she has the first bat mitzvah in America. But could you talk a little bit about what role sort of did Jewish identity play in Jewish women's activism? Is this something that one can sort of tease out, or is the package more, an American Jewish package, as it were?
I think that's a complicated question, and I think it does depend a little bit from individual to individual. As I've already mentioned, there were people who drew on these biblical precedents of Jewish women as leaders, but they also couldn't claim that most Jewish leaders had been women. I mean, that would just be historically, just not, they couldn't claim that. Although they did, there were kind of publications actually, and especially in Jewish periodicals, looking for more examples of Jewish women, prominent Jewish women in the storied Jewish past. That came out of this time period, I think, when people were looking for role models in the past. I think there were Jewish women who really believed that it was their role in the world to make it better. We heard the term tikkun olam, repairing the world, earlier in the introduction. That term was definitely not in use by any of these activists at the time. You do not see that in the late 19th, early 20th century. But the concept of Jewish identity being about making the world a better place, whether it's in your own community, your own home, your own neighborhood, or the wider world, was very much in play. And for a lot of Jewish women, even those who did not have particular affinity for traditional religious practice, that's what Jewishness was to them. And I would argue that lasted long past this period of the suffrage movement, that for, certainly for the rest of the 20th century and on, that is what Jewish identity became to them, an idea of social justice, an idea of tikkun olam, that this is how you express Jewishness in the world. There were some of these Jewish women activists were more interested in kind of traditional Jewish practices of various kinds. There was a wide spectrum, as was the case within the American Jewish community overall. Many of the women who were involved with Hadassah in the early years, for instance, came out of the Jewish Theological Seminary circle, and these were women who were, pretty traditionally oriented in terms of religious practice, but that didn't stop them. That for them was their motivation. So I think there was a wide spectrum of ways in which Jewishness functioned as part of an activist motivation for women. And I also think, I do think, particularly when you get a little further into the 20th century, into the 20s and especially the 30s, the idea of a Jewish community all over the world was something that a lot of these people thought about. What can we be doing, especially as conditions started to get so bad for Jews in so many places in the 30s. There was thinking in the American Jewish community, an affinity. Here I am, a Jewish woman here. What can I do for my sister elsewhere? What can I do to help them in other places? That's something that brought women into Zionism, and it's also something that brought women into the peace movement during this period, and it's something that brought women out of the peace movement as they began to see that Nazism and Hitler was such a threat to Jewish people that maybe they would have to rethink some of those earlier political affiliations because of their Jewishness. So it's a complicated thing, and I don't want to get focused on today, but I think that the same complications exist today. How does Jewishness motivate people? It's going to be a different answer for different kinds of people. The same way that it's hard to define what is a Jew? Is it race? Is it religion? Is it ethnicity? Is it culture? Is it tradition? Well, the answer to that is yes. It's all of those things, and any one of those alignments could lead to activism.
So you mentioned the peace movement, which is also part of your book, Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, as is the birth control movement. And you connect suffrage with these other two movements, both birth control and anti-war. What is it that you see linking these three political strategies? Why did you decide to write a book with all three together?
Well, what I was interested in doing in writing this book was to, in some ways, kind of correct the narrative of first wave feminism, which had really left Jewish women out of it. So suffrage, as we've now discussed at length, is one example of that, but it's not the only example of that. So I wanted to write about Jewish women, American Jewish women's activism in the major women's movements of the day, and not the major Jewish movements. That we have a lot of literature, which is extremely important and has always been influential in my life, but we have a fair amount of scholarship about Jewish women in the labor movement, for instance, which was in some ways so Jewish it counts as a Jewish movement, even though it wasn't exactly, or Zionism as another example. And so it's very important. It was very important to me to look at what were the other mass women's movements of, and I'll use the term feminist movements of the day, of the early 20th century. And in addition to suffrage, overlapping with and then following on suffrage were the birth control and peace movements. These were the other mass women's movements of the early 20th century. And I wanted to look at the role that Jewish women played in all of these movements. And the thing is that after women got the right to vote, they didn't just go back home, right? They didn't just go cast their ballot and then go home and close the door and forget everything. These were activist women. They were interested in what was going on in the world. It's not like they just stopped. And many of them turned their energies to other kinds of movements. Some of them stayed more within the Jewish community. So Zionism through Hadassah in particular is a good example of that. But just as had always been the case, many Jewish women wanted to get involved with, as Maud Nathan put it, life, as she put it, quote, outside the bounds of the synagogue. She wasn't rejecting the synagogue. She always belonged to a synagogue that she went to regularly. She was very, very Jewish, but she didn't want to only be an activist within the Jewish community. And she didn't change her mind after she got the right to vote. And so the birth control and the peace movements became the two major arenas that were going to mass women's movements in the early part of the 20th century. And Jewish women were incredibly important to both those movements. Our focus here today is on suffrage, so I don't want to go into too much detail about that. But in ways that was not true for the suffrage movement, American Jewish women really shaped the peace movement and the birth control movement in the United States. They absolutely would not have developed in the same way or along the same lines without American Jewish women, which is not an argument I would make for suffrage, actually. One of the differences is that Jewish women's groups, not just individuals, were heavily involved in both birth control and peace. And therefore, they played an institutional role in a way that was not the case for suffrage. And I think a link that we could talk about, something that does link them, is what scholars call, the word that scholars sometimes use, the word is maternalism. The idea that women as mothers have a role to play in the world, and that everything gets seen through that lens. It enables political action. It actually requires political action. You can't just be a mother at home, because your children are out there in the world and they're being exposed to all these things. They might, for instance, get drafted into an army, right? There's no way you can't as a mother keep your children safe at home. And if you want the world to work a certain way for them, you have to do things in the world. And so maternalism is this idea that motherhood is the basis for women's political action. There's some contestation around this. Not all women were motivated by maternalism, but it is a convenient and not just convenient, a useful and I think important way to think about women's activism in the early 20th century. And for Jewish women, this way of thinking was particularly attractive because of the high value that Jewish tradition also puts on the role of mothers and on motherhood. And so there was a natural consonance between maternalism out there in the political realm and the value of motherhood within Jewish culture, wherever we were on the religious spectrum. And so maternalism is something that tied together these three movements for American Jewish women and made them a kind of natural fit. There were certainly other big women's political movements, but these were the three biggest, I would argue, in the late 19th, early 20th century. And American Jewish women were involved in all of them as an extension of both their Jewish commitments and their identification as mothers.
So just to jump ahead, if you wouldn't mind, to the contemporary scene, I'm really struck by the visibility of Jewish women in politics. And for example, thinking about California, right? California has had 2 Jewish women as their senators now for quite a long time, several decades, which is really extraordinary. And yet it's rarely discussed that these are Jewish women. They're quite different, Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein, which gives one a sense of a range of Jewish positions on politics. So I'm just curious, as a historian, how you would see their political activism sort of in the latter half of the 20th century relating to the earlier decades of Jewish women involved in suffrage.
Well, one thing I would say is to think this is a larger answer to this question, but it used to be that the narrative of women's history in America was basically, okay, you have the suffrage movement, it ends in 1920, and then that's it. Women go, there's nothing happens in women's history until Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and then bam, there's feminism again. What's called second wave feminism. That is just patently untrue, just from the very basic historical narrative, untrue. For example, the 2 examples of how that's untrue are the birth control and the peace movements, which were very active in the 20s and the 30s and beyond. And so there were always women who were activists. It's not like it ever went away. This period of what used to be called the doldrums in women's history is not the doldrums at all. There was constant, consistent, continuous activism. People have been trying to pass the ERA since 1923. It has been before Congress every year since 1923, for instance. It didn't get as much publicity in the earlier period as it did later, but the point is that there were always people who were activists. There were labor activists. Women who were industrial union activists played a tremendously important role in continuing to make gains for women, probably more important than the middle class women's movement throughout much of the middle of the 20th century. So there was a kind of industrial feminism that just does not get talked about. So there was never a radical break. And what you find in the 60s with this so-called second wave feminism is that a huge, I'm going to say disproportionate number of the most prominent activists in second wave feminism were Jewish. There's a great book, or a great recent book about this by our colleague Joyce Antler that I recommend to everybody. But many of those women did not, they certainly then and even later were very reluctant to think about or acknowledge their Jewishness as a motivation for their activism. Only in very recent years have they been willing to kind of talk about the fact that actually their Jewish grandmothers who had been suffragists or birth control or peace activists had a big impact on their lives. For instance, Pauline Steinem, Gloria Steinem's Jewish grandmother, is in my book because she's somebody who was a suffrage activist. It's not necessarily that activists like Steinem or others denied that they were Jewish, but they did kind of deny that Jewishness had anything to do with their activism until later. Only recently they've been more willing to say, actually, when I did know that everybody in the room with me in my consciousness raising group was Jewish. I didn't know that. Actually, everybody I was involved with, and even a more, and I'm saying this with a lowercase c, more conservative group, something like the League of Women Voters, was a lot of those leaders were Jewish too. Once they started to think about it, they began to realize that there had been this consistent through line of Jewish women's activism in the women's movement. And so to me, it's actually not so surprising that you would have a lot of prominent Jewish women in politics today. And if you ask, my guess is that if you asked a lot of them about their family histories, they would have stories to tell about generations of Jewish women who were active outside the home. And that could even be the case even if their mothers or grandmothers had been very traditional suburban Jewish housewives in the 1950s, they were still involved outside of their homes and in the community and in trying to do good for women in a lot of ways. And so that to me makes it a little bit less surprising, thinking about a legacy, generations of Jewish women's activism in the context of a women's movement that was not always as loud as it was in certain periods, but always existed and always had some kind of voice. So I think that these are important. There's an important historical context to think about there. I can't actually comment. I don't know if Barbara Boxer or Dianne Feinstein in particular have somebody in their lives. It wouldn't surprise me at all, though. I think it's a very common experience that there's this legacy that's been passed down. It's your job to make the world a better place. And one of the ways you can do it is by getting involved in politics.
So the work that you did, right, for this book on ballots, babies, and banners of peace was really a while ago, including when you were at the University of Michigan's Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies. What have you been working on since then?
Okay, well, I have two answers to that question. I should say that I have two scholarly hats that I wear. I am clearly a historian of American Jewish women and American Jewry more generally, but I also am somebody who writes extensively about the history of childhood and youth in America. My first book was about adolescent Jewish girls in the United States during the late 1800s and early 1900s, including some of the women I've talked about today. I wrote about them when they were girls before they became famous. So if you want to know more about Maud Nathan and her sister Annie Nathan Meyer when they were teenagers, you could read my first book. They didn't know yet they'd be famous. Some of the girls in that book did know that they'd be famous. They were determined that they would be famous, but not all of them. And I'm interested in the ordinary people's experiences. So I had written extensively about childhood and youth. Another of my books is about immigrant children in the United States. All of this is by way of to explain my most recent book. I have a book that just came out a few months ago, and it is a social history of ballet class in America, which may seem like it's something totally different, but it's really not, in the sense that I'm also a historian of childhood and someone who is always interested in the way that gender and childhood in particular interact and the way that gender operates in society. So this book, which is called Ballet Class, An American History, which just came out from Oxford University Press, is a social history of ballet class. It's not about the people who became famous dancers. It's about regular people, kids like me, and I'm guessing probably a lot of the people who are watching this right now, who took ballet class at some point in their lives. And I'm interested in how ballet class became part of American childhood across the 20th century, across all kinds of borders of race and class and gender and sexuality. So that's one answer, and that's what I have spent most of the time since publishing my book on American Jewish women's activism. My next book project was about ballet class, and that has resulted in my new book, Ballet Class, An American History. But I never will I ever go away from American Jewish women's history. So I always had a second project going, which is now my main focus, now that the ballet book is out. And now I'm writing about American Jewish women who traveled abroad between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, basically between the Civil War and World War II. So I'm interested in looking at several generations of American Jewish women and their travel experiences. And I got interested in this as a result of my previous work. I found in my book on adolescent Jewish girls and in my book on American Jewish activists that many of them went abroad pretty regularly. Now, of course, it wasn't possible for, let's say, a sweatshop girl to go on vacation abroad. Like, that's not something that happened. And in fact, many immigrants and the children, especially the immigrants themselves, came to the United States and had absolutely no interest in going back. They didn't want to go back where they came from. They'd been forced out. They weren't interested. But their children and their grandchildren sometimes were interested in revisiting places. And there was a whole cohort of American Jews that with a more middle class status who very often went to the fashionable places people would go. So I'm interested in looking at the ways that gender and religious identity, or Jewish identity, whether it's explicitly religious or not, played in travel experiences of this whole, several generations of American Jewish women who went abroad and wrote letters and kept scrapbooks and wrote diaries and published travel memoirs and did all kinds of things to document their experiences. Some of these are some of the women I've written about before. Maud Nathan, for instance, I mentioned in the summer of 1913 alone, went to 5 different international activist conferences. People involved in the suffrage, birth control, and peace movements traveled internationally. They knew each other, right? And there was a whole group of Jewish women who were the leaders of the peace movement in particular, but also birth control, who knew each other and actually then, in some cases, in the European case, helped each other escape when the time came that became, unfortunately, necessary. But there were also people who went abroad for education. There were people who went abroad to find husbands. There were women who went abroad with family members on tours, sometimes just a few people in a kind of traveling group. And I'm interested in where they went, what they did, why they did it, how they behaved. And I'm also very interested in looking at how Jewish identity shaped those trips, which it did. Many of the Jewish women who were not particularly affiliated with any congregation or whatever at home, when they were abroad, made sure that they visited Jewish historic sites. They went to synagogues. They went to services sometimes, even if they never did at home. They visited Jewish cemeteries. They did what we might today call heritage tourism, not a term in use at the time. And their Jewish identity, in a way, kicked into gear while they were abroad. And although many of them went to Europe, they did go other places as well. I already, in pretty early days on this project, I already have documents from people who went to Asia, who went to Southeast Asia, and especially I'm interested in the Jewish women who went to Israel or Palestine, pre-state Israel, to Palestine in the 20s and the 30s, which includes people from a wide variety of political persuasions and Jewish connections. And what did it mean to them to go visit this place in this time? So that's my new project. And it'll be a while before it'll show up in book form, but I'm already starting to publish, and it is related to this work, right? Jewish women had an international interests and an international presence that I think is important to track. And so I hope that my work on activism and this new work explicitly on travel will help contribute to that.
Well, thank you very much. I think that we're open now for other questions about suffrage, about American Jewish women, about politics, the whole sort of range of what you've covered. It's really been fascinating to listen to you speak about it. So I'm going to turn it over to our coordinator of questions, okay? Thanks very much.
Thank you both for a fascinating and empowering conversation. We do have some time to take questions. You can just raise your hand to signal me if you have one for Melissa or Deborah.
I'm going to get us started because I have a question for Deborah. I'm interested in the photographers that you've been working on lately, the few women who are among the ones that you've been profiling, and what was their attitude toward some of these movements? Maybe they were involved. What was their attitude? It's another example of how Jewish identity can show up in interesting places. So I'm wondering if you tell us a little bit about that.
Well, some of the photographers, women photographers, who take photographs really starting in the late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, come to photography in part out of left-wing backgrounds, and see photography as a means of empowerment, which is one of the themes that we're talking about. Empowerment of ordinary people, and empowerment in terms of seeing the world. So these are the years when photography is becoming widespread in terms, Life magazine and Look magazine both start in 1936, and we become, in the United States, as well as in Europe, a very much more visually oriented culture, and photographs are part of it. So women photographers had an involvement with it that reflected their commitment to a point of view with photography. They felt that one needed to have a point of view, and mostly that involved taking pictures of people, which is not something quite so easy. And I'm not talking about portraits, I'm talking about more street photography, where you are engaged with essentially strangers, and taking their photographs in that regard. So.
I have a question for Melissa. Melissa, I was really intrigued to think about what you said about how these women had to get out the vote when they could not vote. And I wondered if there are any interesting stories about the tactics that Jewish women used to rally the support for suffrage when they weren't voters.
Okay. So there were a number of tactics and strategies that all women had to use, not just Jewish women, but thinking about the Jewish community, one was to really keep the issue alive within the Jewish community. There was a whole group of Jewish women who constantly wrote about suffrage for the American Jewish press. They never let it die down. Never. They were constantly writing in letters, organizing symposia that would be published, getting prominent Jewish women to comment on suffrage. And they did actually usually give space to anti-suffragists to participate in the symposia too. For instance, Annie Nathan Meyer was a participant in one of the suffrage symposia that was published in the American Hebrew. She got to have her say also. So they weren't trying to muffle anybody exactly, but they really kept the issue alive. They pressed their synagogues to let them speak about suffrage. And sometimes rabbis were kind of the head of the congregations and would allow a suffrage activist to come and give a talk at the synagogue, even though most of the members were not that interested, or sometimes were actively hostile, especially in the earlier, let's say in the late 19th century, before the movement really took off again. So they never let things stop. I also think within families, people really pressured, women and the men who were already committed really pressured other people around them. Certainly within the labor movement, where, again, the vote was not seen as the cure-all for all the problems of the labor movement. But it was just so obvious that if women could vote, they would be able to get politicians in place who would be more sympathetic to various issues that the labor movement wanted, reforms that needed to come from a governmental source. That a lot of the women who were involved with the labor movement put a lot of pressure on their union, on their kind of co-union members, and they really, they said, if you don't work with us, if you don't help us, how are we going to get anything done in the labor movement, right? We're not winning, right? The labor movement very rarely got concessions on the governmental level. Here's an opportunity to double our representation. So just as a very practical thing, right? Help us get the right to vote and we will all have better lives. And so there were ways in which various Jewish women, used whatever position they had in order to try to keep the issue alive within the American Jewish community.
I would add on that also that Jewish immigrant women and Jewish immigrant men worked in the same industries.
Yeah.
So especially the unmarried women, that is, would be in the garment industry together with these men. And so men saw them as co-workers and not just as wives or daughters. And that I think that was an important identity that these Jewish women had, and could help make the case, as you pointed out, Melissa, for a strong vote that it would help them in terms of their larger claims for social justice and economic justice.
I have a question about when you were doing your research, how did you identify Jewish women as distinct from other women in groups? Did it have to do with women from the labor movement moving into the suffragist movement as a group? And secondly, were you able to identify other groups, other religious groups? For instance, were there groups, was there a large participation among Quaker women? And did other people's religion, like Roman Catholic women, were they prevented more from being part of the suffragist movement because of their religion? And
okay. So, I mean, it's interesting about the Quaker women. Quaker women would, of course there were Quaker women in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th century, but they were less identifiable in some ways as Quakers than they had been earlier, and I would actually argue would be again later. In the 30s, in the 20s and 30s, Quaker women became really important in the American peace movement. There is though a prominent example of a Quaker woman in the suffrage movement, and that's Alice Paul, who was in charge of the more militant wing, the militant arm, let's say, of the suffrage movement, and was very vocal about the fact that her Quaker background, coming from a religious background in which men and women were equal in religious terms, equal before God, really had an impact on her belief, her belief about radical equality, actually, because Alice Paul's wing of the suffrage movement, the National Women's Party, then became the organization pushing the ERA from 1923 on, as I already mentioned. Not everyone in the ERA was Quaker by any means, but it did come, I think, partially out of her religious background. Catholic women were a much larger element in the United States, particularly after successive waves of immigration of German Catholic women and Irish Catholic women and then Italian Catholic women. But there was much less of an organized Catholic suffrage presence. There were certainly Catholic suffragists, and there were even suffragist nuns who were involved. But institutionally, the way that the church kind of operated in the United States, on the way it was organized, kind of parish by parish, did not kind of lead to the same kind of mass involvement as Jewish women had. Again, there were definitely suffragist Catholics. I don't want to, I'm not trying, but I would say that they weren't as visible as some of the individual Jewish women were. In the suffrage movement, and then the Catholic women did and could organize. So, for instance, many Catholic women's groups were very involved in the birth control movement, in terms of opposing it. Not all Catholic women opposed the birth control movement, but there were organized groups of Catholic women who did. So it depended a little bit on what the issue was. The problem is, or maybe the benefit, right? The benefit for the Jewish community is that there is no central authority in Judaism. No one person can say, stop doing this or start doing that will have any kind of impact. But because of the hierarchy within the Catholic Church, there are authorities who can, even if they're not going to be totally listened to, who can at least say, all Catholics must do this, or this parish does not do that. And so there are structural differences between the way that the Catholic community operated in the United States and the way the Jewish community did, where kind of nobody could tell anyone to do anything in a way that would have that much of an impact. So I think that's an interesting issue. A group that did contribute quite a bit to the suffrage movement, particularly in the West, is the Latter-day Saints, as I mentioned before. There was a very strong Mormon suffragist presence. Mormon women, actually used the suffrage movement to make the point that they were not all these downtrodden plural wives. They wanted to show through the suffrage movement that they had a spiritual status, that they believed in the differences between men's and women's roles, but that did not preclude women having the right to vote. And so Mormon women were pretty visible within the suffrage movement. As was the case with the Jewish community, there were some anti-suffrage Mormons, not surprisingly, but that's another example of a religious group that, as a religious group, had some prominence within the suffrage movement.
Right, but you didn't talk about the your research, how you come to identify.
Yes, sorry. Well, the research was quite extensive. For those of you who do take a look at Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, you don't have to read it, but you'll see there are many, many, many pages of endnotes and bibliography at the end. I did research in archives all across the United States. It was as is the case with most of the books that historians like Deborah write, historians like me write, this is a many-year process. I was very committed to not writing a story focused on New York. And New York is important. It's an important center of American Jewish life, but it's not the only one. And I was very committed to doing research outside of New York, and which I feel that I did for this book. It's set all over the United States and not just in large urban areas. I would say because I did most places where I went to do research, I did research in both a Jewish archive and in the, I guess I'll call it the non-Jewish archive. So for instance, when I was in Chicago, I went to was now the Chicago History Museum, but also the Chicago Jewish Archives. In Philadelphia, I went to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, but also to the Philadelphia Jewish Archives Center, which is now part of the Urban Archives at Temple. Every place I went, I did research in both of those kinds of settings, so to make sure that I was casting as wide a net as possible. I also went to places like the Sophia Smith Collection at Smith College, which is an extremely important repository for American women's history, and also the Schlesinger Library on the history of American women at Harvard. So in some cases, I knew the names of some of the people I was going to do research on, but I was not only interested in the Maud Nathans of the world. I wanted to know about the regular, ordinary people, the Jewish women who got involved in politics and in the suffrage movement. And I found them everywhere I looked. They were just, Jewish women were so engaged in these issues across the country in all kinds of settings. It's an interesting research question, how you know if somebody is Jewish, which I take as part of your question. I would say that for most of the period that I was looking at, you could rely to some degree on names. There's recently been a book about Jewish name changing, a wonderful book by my close friend and colleague, Kirsten Vermeglish, called Rosenberg by Any Other Name, about Jewish name changing. But for the period that I was looking at, especially the earlier part, not as many Jewish people were changing their names. And actually the point was that if I saw somebody who had a very Jewish name in an archive, let's use a very stereotypical example of Rebecca Rosenberg, it was probably a pretty safe bet that she was Jewish. I couldn't say that 100% of the time, and I did do research on names that I was completely unfamiliar with. I didn't just let it go. I did try to get some information. You can use census records, for instance. If Rebecca Rosenberg grew up in a household, let's say in Chicago or even in Des Moines, and her parents were named Jaime and Anna, and they were born in Poland, then she's Jewish. I think that's an okay assumption to make. So that is one way in which I tried to identify, who people were. Also, many of these women were involved with Jewish women's organizations, which I would say is another safe bet for trying to identify, what their background was. So I did research not only in Jewish sources, and I found Jewish women just everywhere. And it is also the case that sometimes they were just identified in the documents about them, either by themselves or by others, as being Jewish. And so it wasn't hard to find just tremendous participation across the country of Jewish women in these mass movements.
So my question is, in your research, it just seems to me that Jewish women, their activism is for structural change a lot. They work to make changes, societal changes, and more so, it's hard to say more so, but then non-Jewish women who maybe go do more from the ground up kind of,
I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say, but and maybe it's where I live. You know, I live in Ann Arbor, and I went to McGill, and but I grew up in Calgary, Alberta. So, I just, the Jewish women that I've met ever since I've been around a lot of Jewish people, and I converted, because of my activism, because I felt that the social justice thing was such a big part of the faith. And I'm just wondering, did you pick that up in your research? Where are you in that? I mean, that's just the way I experience it, and I don't know if it's just my experience.
Well, one of the things that I found is that it was very clear in doing this research about Jewish women's activism is that the phrase "the personal is political" comes from a later period, right? Comes from second wave feminism, but that is a clear description of the way that Jewish women thought about their activism. For some of them, it came out of personal experiences, maybe frustrations of various kinds. Maybe they ran up against various structural inequities, and that caused them to think about it. That could also be true for a communal group. Let's say a group of women, and this is true not just for Jewish women, wanted to accomplish something, but they ran into walls that they just couldn't get through because they didn't have the vote. They didn't get that kind of political respect. So I think that phrase, "the personal is political," applies very much to this earlier period as well. Right? Jewish women who wanted to have more opportunities and felt constrained by not having a political voice, that's "the personal is political." Jewish women who wanted to have some say in what their families would look like and therefore got involved with the birth control movement, even long after their own childbearing years had passed, that's "the personal is political." Jewish women who aren't really too excited about their sons going off to war, okay, that's "the personal is political." Right? So you don't have to have a personal experience to have political interest, and there are plenty of people who do not only act out of self-interest. I don't mean to imply that. But I do think that for women, given the constraints that historically women have operated under, coming up against those constraints makes people think about not just themselves, but a wider world as well. And then the social justice background that is part of Jewish culture and heritage, I'm a little hesitant to say it made Jewish women more sensitive to that, but I do think it helps explain why Jewish women were so sensitive to that. And that's the legacy that Jewish women in America and elsewhere have followed on with, until the present day. That's, I think, one of the legacies that we can be proudest of, right? That I'm proudest of as a Jewish woman. Women got the right to vote, and they didn't just only think about themselves. Oh, now I have the right to vote and I'm going to stop. No, what else can I do? What can I do with this now? And that's a legacy that I think is really important for thinking about American Jewish women.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, wonderful questions. And to close, I'm going to turn it over to Roddy Wares from the League of Women Voters to wrap up this wonderful conversation for us. Roddy?
Thank you. Well, I'm really excited that I was asked to say what we think. I'm with the League of Women Voters, and I'm in their voter registration committee. What we can do to get out the vote, to get out the vote. And it's really interesting to me that 100 years later, we still have to fight to have everyone have the vote, to have everyone have access to the vote, and to have a level playing field. And so I love working for the League because that's our mission, is to make those things happen. So before I talk about what we can do, and I'm really glad there actually is something concrete that we can do, I want to tell everybody something that makes me very happy, and that is the voting pattern of the 18 to 21-year-olds in Washtenaw County. And I don't know if you know this, but back in 2014, in that midterm election, 2,898 18 to 21-year-olds voted. Then in 2018, the next midterm election, 10,604 18 to 21-year-olds voted. So they more than 300% increase in their vote, but it was also a more than 300% increase in their portion of the vote. So the rest of people and all the other age groups didn't increase like that. They increased maybe by 60%, but the young people increased by more than 300%. So if you remember, they voted 10,640 votes. Well, the presidential election in Michigan was decided by 10,704 votes. So that means that just these young people, not that they would all vote the same, but there were enough young people there to almost change that election. And so I've been going to the high schools, our team has been going to the high schools 3 years now. And so I thought after the 2018 election, maybe there would be, and it wasn't just the high schools. The University of Michigan did a great job. Washtenaw Community College, EMU had higher percentage even than Michigan vote. So all the young people got out. And I thought there would be a lull, but there's not. People are just really excited about voting, and they really want to vote. So, so we've almost everyone. And what happens is we go to the high schools, and some of the kids are too young, and that makes them want to vote even more. Like, oh no, I can't vote this year. I've got to vote next year. So that's what's been happening. So, so what can we do to get out the vote? So I've been registering people to vote for years and years. And generally people think, well, you just get people to register to vote. That's what we'll do. But in fact, and I just found this out this year, and I still find it very hard to believe, in 2018, only fewer than 5% of the people who are eligible to vote are not registered in Michigan. In 2016, it was less than 3%. So there's almost no one out there who's not young, who's not registered in Michigan. So it's, in terms of how many people we can register, it's not really the best bang for your buck. But what we can do now is make sure that everybody votes by mail. And so in May 5th, which was just not that last week, a week ago and a day, because of the virus, 90%, there's a May 5th election, and usually the turnout is 12%. So it was all over 90% voted by mail, and the turnout was almost 25%. It was double, it was double the normal average. So we did send, there were ballot applications sent to everyone. So that happened. But that's what we want, is we want everyone to have an absentee ballot application sent to them. And there's a really easy way to do that. And that is to get on the permanent absentee voter list. And once you're on that list, you get an application every single time. And then all you have to do is send that in and get your ballot. So what we can do, what everyone can do, is to make sure everyone votes by mail. And one way to make sure of that is to make sure everyone gets on the permanent absentee ballot list. And we have the best county clerks in the world in Washtenaw County. And they have made a website, because there are 24 different jurisdictions in Washtenaw County. And in order to get on a permanent list, you have to get on your township or your city's permanent list. And they all have different, and they kind of get to decide how they want people to apply for that. But the clerks have one website that you can go to, and when you follow the prompts and you tell which township you're in, you fill that out, you're automatically in. And from then on, every single election, you get an absentee ballot. And so what we can do is we can tell all of our friends, get on the permanent voter list. And I'm going to put up there's going to be a slide when we leave, and there's a website on the League of Women Voters, votesforwomen100.org website. And I'll leave it there so people can take a picture of it if they want to. And at the top, you just go to this website, and it'll take you to the Washtenaw County website, and there you go, and you're already in. And the other thing is, the earliest I've ever seen it, the absentee ballot applications are now available. They came out this week. And you can download those from the Secretary of State website, michigan.gov/vote. and fill that out. And in that application, you can sign up for a ballot for both August and for November. And there's a box to be in a permanent list. So everybody in the whole state can also do that. So I want to think of this as concentric circles, which is what we're asking the high school kids to do as well, is to reach out to all the people you know and say, get an absentee ballot, and this is how you do it. Get on the permanent list, and then ask them to get to all their friends that they know and ask them to also make sure you have an absentee ballot, and that so you can vote by mail. And hopefully it'll come back to you. These concentric circles, you should be asked about 4 or 5 times if this works. So that's we have that we can do, and so that's really exciting that you have something concrete, because often there's not. And if we all vote by mail, and we're with the league, we want everyone to vote every time. And so it's a tough time, but it's an exciting time. And rather than having our voice silenced, our voice will be amplified. So that's what we want to do. Thanks.
This program was released May 26th, 2020 by the Ann Arbor District Library.